Greetings, my friends. Jimmer Lins here with your Source Filmmaker Tip of the Day. Today is Tip of the Day number 14. As always, thank you for tuning in, for subscribing, for being cool people, and checking out my YouTube channel. I really appreciate it, and it's my privilege to bring you these tips. Today, as I said, is Tip of the Day number 14, and in today's tip, we are going to talk about a technique that you can use to improve the quality of your rendered posters and movies by using the controls to affect SSOA, or Screen Space Ambient Occlusion. Now, I have to give some credit for this one to a gentleman named Max of 2SD on the Facepunch forums. Max of 2SD posted a thread about how you can use SSOA bias, SSOA strength, and SSOA radius to affect the final quality of renders. And these were things that I hadn't experimented with, so I got to give him some credit for pointing these out and for giving me something to look at and experiment with, and then ultimately bring it to you as a tip of the day. So, thank you to Max. Now, moving on, what I've done before I started recording was I set up a simple shot with a demo man standing there, and I put a couple of lights on him. Now, right now, I am not running any ambient occlusion. I suppose I should take a second and just explain real briefly what ambient occlusion is. Ambient occlusion is a way that computers who are rendering 3D models, like, say, in Team Fortress 2 or in Half-Life 2, can use to determine how bright each pixel on the screen needs to be based on the light hitting it, as well as the light hitting it after being reflected off of other surfaces. As you can imagine, if you think about it, it's actually a lot of work to compute all of that. And true ambient occlusion is actually much too heavyweight for modern computers to render in real time. So you don't ever actually see true ambient occlusion in game, for example, because it can take several seconds to render even a simple frame with ambient occlusion. But screen space ambient occlusion is a slightly different way of getting to a similar effect that's not quite as pretty, but can be done in real time. So you can render 30, 40, 50, 60, whatever number of frames per second your overclocked, liquid-cooled, helium-powered system is using. Now, for our purposes, I'm just going to show you how these controls can affect a little bit about the way the final shots will look like for you when you're rendering your movies. Right now, you're looking at a demo man that I posed before I began the shot, and right now there is no ambient occlusion turned off. I have turned it off in the render settings by unchecking the ambient occlusion box, which is something a lot of people do while they're working in Source Filmmaker because it gets rid of like an annoying grainy overlay effect, but we're going to turn it on right now. And as you can see, that changed the look of this demo man model. Now we're seeing this sort of blocky look. And the reason that is occurring is because I have deliberately created a camera with really poor ambient occlusion settings. So you can see kind of what it's doing. And if you look here, what it's actually doing is it's detecting the wrinkles here as producing more shadow than they should. And I think it's even detecting some of the edges of the model producing shadows because it's really not doing a detailed enough pass. And so you get this really sort of ugly, blocky look. So if I change over to another camera that has better ambient occlusion settings, you can see that we get this much deeper, richer look, and it's a much nicer look with much more detailed shadows. So what is going to affect how this occurs? So the first thing we'll do is I'll switch back over to camera 3 here, or excuse me, to camera 2, which is the one that has the bad settings. And I'm going to show you these three controls: SSOA bias, SSOA strength, and SSOA radius. Now, these controls will affect different amounts or different aspects of the way it works. And I can't give you specific details because I don't know internally exactly how these things affect specific elements of the way it works. But I can tell you what seems to look good. And this is based on what I've heard from other people and my own experimentation. And for most of the shots, I have found that it is effective to turn the bias up about halfway or a little bit more than halfway, and the strength up about a fourth of the way. But again, as I always say, experiment with all of these things. And then I generally will turn the radius up just a tiny touch from its radius is one you're going to want to experiment with. I've got it turned up just a little bit. Here's an interesting little trick, though. If you go into the render settings and you say show ambient occlusion, you can actually see what the ambient occlusion is going to affect in the final render so that you can, for example, play with those settings. Camera 2 has really poor settings, and camera 3 has really good settings or better settings. So if I switch from camera 2 to camera 3, you can see how this darker area down here, it's not black, but there's darker areas here underneath his collar and on this side of his face, and the shadows are much richer and more fully defined. Now, if I go in here, and by the way, any changes here, they have to be done in the motion editor, so you have to do all those changes in here. So, like if I go in here and I change the bias, you can see that it affects how, sort of how large the shadows really grow. And I think that affects how much they'll creep into the light. Then we've got the strength, and that affects how far around the edges of the model that the shadows seem to come in. So it basically, I look at it, I kind of internally think of it as how powerful is the darkness when we're shining a light on a model. And then the radius, it is an interesting setting. With the radius all the way down, nothing will show up. And with the radius all the way up, it looks kind of terrible. So again, I try and keep the radius. Usually I turn it down just a little bit from the default, but not by too much. So there you have it. And none of these things will show up very clearly until you switch back over to the timeline view after you've committed it, because the source filmmaker doesn't render these things in great detail until you're in the timeline view. And sometimes the actual view render can lag a few seconds behind. Again, I'll switch over to camera 2, and you can see that it doesn't look right. This is not what the shadows should look like. And I could actually, make them even more terrible if I wanted to. Oops, that's the wrong, I'm manipulating the wrong camera. No wonder I'm not seeing any changes. If I turn the bias down a little further and so forth. I mean, what I recommend you do is experiment with some of these settings and see what works for you. Personally, I have found that setting the bias a little more than halfway up to a little bit, up to 3/4 of the way seems to be a nice balance for what I like. Setting the strength to about 1/4 to 1/3 of the way up, and the radius usually about midway, maybe a little less. Again, experiment. Also, these settings are going to be radically affected by lighting conditions in your scenes, so don't think that there is a one-size-fits-all. Play with the settings, see what works for you, and get a feel for it. And so yeah, SSOA bias is a great way to improve the final look and feel of your scenes, because when it's actually rendered, it can produce some really nice effects and give you some really nice depth to your images. Keep in mind, though, that ambient occlusion, when you turn it on, can have a pretty significant effect on render times. So if you're just rendering a draft or something like that, just turn off ambient occlusion when you're doing it, because then it'll render a lot quicker and you can see what it'll look like. But when you want to get the nice, sexy look and feel for the final one, then go with the ambient occlusion turned on, as well as depth of field and motion blur, of course. All right, so that is your tip of the day number 14. I am, as always, your servant, Jimmer Lins, and I appreciate you listening. I hope you are enjoying using Source Filmmaker, and have a great day.